Guys, I'm Paul Ryan, your host of the Not ATB Fantasy Show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. With me, as always, is my co-host, the best co-host in the world, Dave PigskinPapers Hartman. Dave, how are you?
I'm doing well. We've never recorded during the day before, so I'm slightly confused to be doing this during the day. But we haven't done a show since before a couple weeks actually before the NFL draft. So we talked about the draft in advance, and now we get a chance to recap it a little bit and to start looking ahead to the 2024 fantasy football season. We'll hit on both of those in this show, so I'm excited to talk about that. How are you doing, Paul?
I can't complain, Dave. It is a little weird to be doing the show during the day, but I actually kind of like the vibe a little bit.
Yeah, it's different for sure.
Where can we find you on X, Dave?
Yep, I'm at Pigskin Papers. My website is thepigskinpapers.com. I put a little bit of content up before the draft. Haven't written anything since the draft, but hopefully we'll have some fantasy football related post-draft content up there sometime in the next couple of weeks. Where can people find you on X, Paul, and where can they get out your content?
Yes, I'm Paul Ryan. You can find me on X at Paul_Ryan15. As far as all my content, you can find it on X and on YouTube. Lately, these days, on the Cowboys front, we just did our draft recap earlier this week, and kind of like this show, we had recorded in a couple weeks. So I'm glad that I get to talk a little bit more draft and put a fantasy spin on it.
Nice.
All right, well, Dave, I'm happy to see you again, man. It's been a while, as we've discussed. The draft has come and gone, and I'm excited to recap it and break it down with you. As we always do, we'll start off with our teams, the Dallas Cowboys and Miami Dolphins. So, Dave, one of Miami's biggest needs was offensive line heading into the draft, but they elected to draft on the other side of the line and draft Chop Robinson and add another piece to their defensive line. How do you feel about the pick, and was it the right move, and how do you like the rest of their draft?
Yeah, good question, Paul. The Dolphins came into this draft with a first-round pick, a second-round pick, and no third or fourth-round pick. And my expectation, given the losses they had in the offseason on both lines, is that those first two picks would be dedicated to offensive and defensive line in whatever order, and maybe only addressing one side if the value fell the right way. I was paying attention to the draft, and the two picks before Miami picked were Jared Verse went with the 19th pick, and then Troy Fautanu went to the Steelers with the 20th pick. And I kind of have a feeling Miami would have taken either one of those guys had they fallen, but they didn't. And so, with Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb both coming off season-ending injuries, and they lost Andrew Van Ginkel, I'm not surprised that, given the value on the board at offensive line, that they went with an edge rusher there. Chop Robinson was a little bit of a polarizing prospect coming into this draft, just because he tested off the board. He's got the traits, crazy athleticism, crazy speed off the edge, but he didn't really have the production in college. He only had 4 sacks his senior year, although he had apparently one of the highest pass rush win rate numbers in college football. He just didn't get home that much. I think they'll use him as a situational pass rusher the first year, with Chubb and Phillips kind of easing back in. So it's kind of a good spot for him. He probably doesn't need to be an every down player. I thought it was an okay pick. I might have been happier if they took Graham Barton, the versatile offensive lineman from Duke, who can, kind of play all 5 positions on the line. He went a little later. They did take maybe not even developmental. They took a monster of a tackle in the second round, with Teron Armstead getting a little older and almost never playing all 17 games. I thought that pick made a lot of sense, and he was a highly graded player. I really liked so their first 2 picks, I think, were fine. I was a little iffy on Robinson, and we'll have to see on him. But I really liked some of the value they got later in the draft. Mo Kamara, the pass rusher out of Colorado State, also like crazy fast and athletic, a little undersized. I think he'll rotate in a lot this year also. And, he could end up being better than Chop Robinson. You never know. But I thought he was a really good value where they got him. I thought Malik Washington, the wide receiver out of Virginia, who I think led all of FBS in catches last year. He's small, but he's another really fast player for that Mike McDaniel offense. He'll operate out of the slot. I kind of like that pick a little more before they signed Odell Beckham, but I think there will be opportunities for both of them to play, and we'll get to that a little later on. So overall, and I liked what they did in adding Jalen Wright. I know they gave up a future third, but they should have 2 compensatory third rounders next year. So they kind of had 2, maybe 3 third rounders to play with. And Raheem Mostert is 32. He's the oldest starting running back in the NFL, maybe the oldest running back on a roster right now. He stayed healthy last season. That was unusual. Devon Achane, not really a guy you want to give the ball to 25 times a game, because I don't know if he'll hold up to that. With the new kickoff rules, I think a guy like Jalen Wright is good to have. Someone who's really fast, who can be your kind of third running back and also handle those short kickoff duties and maybe make some big plays in the kicking game. So I didn't mind that they gave up a future third to take him in the 4th. So overall, considering the number of picks they had going in, I thought it was a pretty good draft for them. You kind of always feel like your team had a good draft, or you want to feel that way. But this time I don't really feel like I'm convincing myself. I think that they got good values late, and that's always, look, any of these players could bust. Any of these players could be great. We don't know. We're just going by what the scouts tell us and the draft analysts. But overall, I was pretty happy with their draft. Now let's switch to your team, the Cowboys. Their first round pick came about 5 picks after Miami, I think, because they were a division winner and had a slightly better record than the Dolphins. But in any case, the Cowboys lost 2 starters on the offensive line and several other players in key positions. So rumors were swirling before the draft that Tyler Guyton was kind of like, I'll put it in air quotes, their guy. But Guyton only started 14 games in college, all at right tackle. Do you think Dallas, as currently constituted with their offense, is good enough to kind of take on what might be a tiny bit of a project or risk at a key position on the offensive line? And how did you like the rest of their draft?
As far as Guyton goes, I don't hate the pick only because I like that we were able to trade back, acquire another 3rd round pick, and then still get the guy who, like you said, people thought that was their guy, even at pick 24. A report came out that's saying that they were going to take Tyler Guyton even at 24. So to trade back and be able to get him, I like doing that. That being said, as far as the project goes, yeah, it is a bit scary. I won't lie. However, the upside is unlimited. He has the upside to be, like a Tyron Smith-esque type of player from what I'm hearing. And really the only thing holding him back, I think it's teachable things. It's just like his hand technique and things like that. So as much of a project as it is, lined up next to Tyler Smith, I feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, and that's a coachable thing. And also the Cowboys have had so much success with offensive line draft picks that they've made. How about the rest of their draft, Paul? What did you think of what they did on day 2 and 3?
I really like what the Cowboys did in this draft simply because they drafted premium positions that where they really did need, rather than reaching for need and taking players of less valuable positions like off-ball linebacker and running back. Everybody thought that the Cowboys were going to take a running back early. They didn't. I like their approach, drafting premium players with premium picks.
Nice. Okay.
So, you talked about it earlier, Dave, the addition of Odell Beckham Jr. recently to the Miami Dolphins, and they also added Jonnu Smith to be their new starting tight end. How impactful do you think those guys will be, and how do you think they'll fit in the offense?
Yeah, I was kind of indifferent a little bit on the Odell signing, but because they're not bringing in Odell to be their number one receiver or their number two receiver, or even necessarily their third option in the passing game, because they throw to their tight ends a lot. They drafted Malik Washington. I think it's a decent signing. It's only $3 million guaranteed, and Odell's probably a bit washed, but at the same time, when he played last year, he still looked pretty effective at times, and he can still get open. And in an offense where he's not the guy that defenses are going to worry about because of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, I think Mike McDaniel will find ways to use Odell in certain moments where it's beneficial to Tua and the offense. For a guy like Odell, who's a savvy route runner, good hands, and kind of knows what he's doing, and can maybe help bring Malik Washington along a little bit as well. I do think Malik Washington is going to play too. And Jonnu Smith is just another kind of good athlete, athletic option that they can use. They also, as I said before, they added Jalen Wright. So they have a lot of guys. They also still have Braxton Berrios, kind of hanging around, assuming he makes the team. So I like their depth. They had a lot of injuries last year at different times. Tyreek got hurt down the stretch. Achane missed a bunch of games. Not to mention all the other injuries they had, not at skill position. So I like that they have added some depth, and I like that they're not looking for either of the two guys you mentioned to be like leaders of the offense. They can just be complementary players. I trust Mike McDaniel to scheme things up for both of them. You may remember it was kind of crazy last year. Arthur Smith was giving Jonnu Smith goal line carries when they had like Bijan Robinson, and it was driving people crazy in the fantasy community. He finally stopped doing it. But they were giving Jonnu Smith carries, and they did that on the Titans also. He's a good athlete. He's a guy who you can line up in a lot of different ways, kind of uses an H-back, uses a tight end. I don't know how much he'll contribute to this offense, but I'm happy to have him as just another weapon that they can play with. So I mentioned running backs, and you mentioned earlier the fact that Dallas did not take a running back, on day two, where people thought they might in like the second or third round or even the fourth round. But hey, they brought back Ezekiel Elliott, which may have surprised some people after all the kind of money stuff they went through with him, all the years he was a Cowboy. But Zeke showed some pretty good legs last year. I mean, he's not explosive anymore, but he's still a capable running back. Is running back a concern for you, looking at the depth chart with Zeke and Rico Dowdle and Deuce Vaughn and whoever else they might have right now?
I wouldn't say it's a concern, but a change of pace back would be a welcome addition. I'm hoping maybe Deuce Vaughn gets an opportunity to showcase his skills this season, and I think he'd be a good complement to Zeke and to Dowdle. But yeah, I wouldn't mind maybe just bringing in another extra body, because we did sign Royce Freeman, but when you think about Freeman, Dowdle, and Zeke, all those guys kind of do the same thing. I think we need somebody who can, like, a big play threat. So let's talk some draft here, Dave. We'll start off with the New England Patriots, and they were in a prime spot with the third overall pick. They were linked to every quarterback outside of Caleb Williams and were willing to trade down. Yet they turned down offers from the Giants and Vikings to trade out of the spot and acquire multiple first-round picks. Outside of Caleb Williams, could Drake may be the best quarterback in this class, do you think?
He certainly could be, and I won't pretend to be clairvoyant enough to try to project how these 6 rookie QBs that went in the first 12 picks, which, by the way, that was just kind of crazy, and we'll touch on the 2 that went towards the end of that. But to see 6 quarterbacks go in the first 12 picks just shows you where the NFL is and how GMs continue to overdraft the position, because the sort of thinking, hey, we're picking high, We believe in our GM and our coach. We don't think we'll be picking this high again anytime soon. So when you're picking high like that and there are QBs on the board that you think warrant the selection, you take them. But we had never seen anything like this, 6 in the first 12 picks. In fact, the only time 6 had gone in the first round was 1983, the Elway, Kelly, Marino draft. And in that draft, the 6th quarterback taken was Marino, and he was taken with the second to last pick of the first round because Miami had gone to the Super Bowl the year before. And this time you had Bo Nix going with the sixth QB taken with just the 12th pick, which, again, just crazy to see the QBs fly like that. But that benefited everyone else because it pushed better players down the board. But getting back to your question, I mean, I think it's interesting what New England did. They had 8 draft picks, and they took 7 players on offense and a corner in the middle rounds. They took a corner. So clearly, they recognized that they had a good defense last year, even with injuries to Matt Judon and Gonzalez, the corner that they took in the first round last year, and that they needed to address the offensive side of the ball, the line, the skill position players. I don't know how good a job they did of that. And I would, if I was them, given that they're likely to be the worst team in their division, one of the worst teams in the AFC, and that they're probably a year away from putting anything too competitive on the field, on offense at least, I would give Drake May, they brought in Jacoby Brissett. I would probably let Drake May sit to start the season, let Brissett kind of work with some of these young players, get them acclimated, and then depending on how the season's going, which it probably won't be going that well, give Drake May a chance. I do like Drake May. I think he's a really good combination of athleticism and a huge arm. And he's only 21, although he'll be 22 before the season starts. I'm a little surprised they didn't either take Marvin Harrison Jr. or trade out, because I don't think that they're 1, 2, or 3 years away from competing, and you kind of want to be able to do that on a rookie QB contract. That said, like I said earlier, these, front offices, when they're picking high like this and there's QBs on the board that everyone thinks are first round talents, they take them. If it was me, I might have taken Marvin Harrison or traded, but nobody pays me anything to run an NFL team. So I'm optimistic for the Patriots that they're kind of bottoming out. But the bottoming out might take a little while. And, with a rookie QB and a lot of young and unproven skill position players, I don't know how good they're going to be this year. And for a fantasy perspective, and we'll talk more fantasy later, I think there's not a lot on this team that I'm going to be sniffing around outside of maybe Ramondre Stevenson. So I've been talking about the quarterbacks, and we'll address now the elephant in the room, the Atlanta Falcons elephant in the room. The first 7 picks of the draft kind of went the way everyone thought they would, and then in something that shocked the entire Twitter sphere and NFL commentators and analysts, the Falcons took Michael Penix Jr. with the 8th pick. They just paid Kirk Cousins $100 million for the next 2 seasons, guaranteed. He's, of course, 35, and he's coming off a torn Achilles and a surgery. So given where Cousins is this pick as bad as everyone made it out to be, in your estimation?
I mean, you give Kirk Cousins over $100 million, that you think that he's got the job locked down. That being said, Kirk is 35 years old, and he's dealt with injuries himself. I mean, I don't actually hate the pick, just because you know how difficult it is to find a quarterback, and you'll do anything to get a quarterback when you don't have one. So it looks bad now, but I don't know. This could be – I don't want to compare it to Aaron Rodgers, Jordan Love, because it's not like that, but this could be kind of that insurance policy. Yeah.
The one thing I'll say, and I kind of agree with you, I think that they got – slammed for the pick from a logic standpoint, a little bit from a value standpoint too, but I don't think Penix was going to get past the Raiders at 13. And if he did, someone was going to trade into the round to take him, I think. maybe in the 20s. But the one part of it that I kind of can't get my head around is that Penix is already 24, right? This would have made more sense to me if it was JJ McCarthy, who's like 20 or 21, to sit behind Kirk Cousins. And McCarthy was on the board. So that would have made more sense to me, because if, let's just say for the sake of argument that Kirk comes back, he's great. Falcons win the division the next 2 years. They decide to give Kirk a third, exercise the option in the contract, give Kirk a third year. It might be Michael Penix might be 27 before he emerges as a starter. And that's too old in my view. Or it's not ideal. So that was the part of it that, like, if you're picking a guy to sit behind your veteran, it's kind of weird that you pick a 24-year-old to do that. But, it's like we said before, if you believe in the player, you have conviction in a quarterback, and you're drafting where you don't think you're going to draft again for a long time, and the Falcons, have a pretty good young team and they're in a bad division, I understand the thinking. We're going to have a luxury. We're going to have 2 QBs. If our guy gets hurt, we have another guy. If our guy falters, we have another guy. Most teams don't have that, but it was head scratching for sure.
Absolutely. When it first happened, I was like, man, what the heck are they doing? But when time passed, I kind of was listening to some fantasy podcasts here and then break down the pick and analyze it. And I've heard some people kind of, make more sense of it. And I was like, I can kind of get a better understanding of why Atlanta might have done that. So we'll see what happens. But, we look at the Chicago Bears, who had 2 top 10 picks in this draft. And after taking Caleb Williams first overall, they decide to go wide receiver and select Rome Odunze with their 9th overall pick. Chicago did trade for Keenan Allen in the offseason. They already had DJ Moore on the roster. Was this a luxury pick by Chicago?
I don't view it as a luxury pick. I think it was a good pick by Chicago. By all accounts, on most big boards, Rome Odunze was like the 5th or 6th best player in this draft, and they got him with the 9th pick. They went best player available for sure. Keenan Allen's 32. I think he's only signed for this year. Rome Odunze is a more highly rated prospect than DJ Moore was when he came out of college. You're drafting a rookie QB. You want to give him as much weaponry to grow with over the next couple of years. And now you've got, Odunze and Caleb Williams on rookie deals with the potential for a 5th-year option. It made all the sense in the world to me. And I also think the way the value on the board lined up, I think any of the defensive players, the edge rushers, would have been a little bit of a reach anywhere inside the top 10. So I know Chicago would love to get someone to pair with Montez Sweat, and Dallas Turner was staring them in the face. But I think with Odunze on the board, they almost had no choice. And I think they, might have been second guessed a lot if they didn't take the best player that was sitting there on the board. And especially, someone who can immediately just help out a young quarterback's development. And maybe Odunze doesn't play more than 75% of the snaps this year. Or maybe he emerges in the second half of the season. He's a real talent, and I would have done what they did.
I don't hate the pick, especially if you think about – sorry, Dave, I was going to say I don't hate the pick, especially when you think about the connection, the early connection between Caleb Williams and Odunze that seems to have developed already. Yeah.
So I mentioned JJ McCarthy earlier in that, he was streaming up draft boards. There were a lot of rumors that Minnesota would have to trade up to either the Cardinals pick at 4 or the Chargers at 5 to get in front of the Giants, who were putting up, some smoke screens that they might be interested. Maybe the Broncos, although it would have been hard for them with the picks they didn't have, or the Raiders, might have jumped Minnesota to try to get up to get McCarthy. But in the end, the Vikings only had to trade up 1 spot with the Jets and take him at pick 10. And, now he goes to a Minnesota team that is pretty loaded with receiving weapons. Did he land in the best situation in terms of landing spot of all the rookie QBs when you consider the weapons they have and the coach they have. And do you think he'll win the job and be the day one starter for the Vikings?
He's tied with Caleb Williams for the best situation among rookie quarterbacks. And anytime you trade and draft a player inside the top 10, he's almost guaranteed to be the starter. I don't think we've seen enough from Sam Darnold to warrant him holding back JJ McCarthy, but you never know.
Yeah, I actually think Darnold's going to be the week one starter, but we'll see. There's no way of knowing right now.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. You definitely, there's no need to rush JJ McCarthy if he's not ready, especially with a guy like Darnold who might not be very good, but at the same time is at least has the experience of starting games. But another kind of a head scratcher pick here was Bo Nix was a player that not many scouts or analysts looked at as a first round talent, and it's unlikely that the Broncos are just a quarterback away from being contenders. Was this the worst pick of the draft from a value perspective?
Well, certainly of all the players taken in the first round, I think he probably collectively had the lowest grade because almost nobody, from what I read, had a first round grade on him, and he went in the top half of the first round. That said, Denver was not in a good position. They didn't have a second round pick. And with 5 QBs already gone, I think they were worried that if they didn't take Nix there was no way they were going to get a quarterback that they liked. And if they traded down, they risked, the Raiders or someone else who's still QB needy, the Giants, some other team trading up to get him or what have you. And again, if Denver took someone else at 12, they weren't picking again until the third round. So I don't think Denver expected 5 QBs to be gone when they picked. I think they probably expected 4 QBs to be gone. Maybe they would have done the same thing anyway if Penix was still on the board, but they might have felt like, okay, well, the Raiders are going to take Penix. We can wait and then use whatever we can to trade up later to get the guy we want, which according to Sean Payton was Bo Nix. But you're right. They're not a quarterback away from being contenders. They're way more than that away from being contenders. Bo Nix, if he starts from day one, is going to be thrown in, much like Bryce Young was last year, with an inferior group of pass catchers. I'm not sure how good their offensive line is, but I guess we'll get to see if Sean Payton really is a QB guru and genius, because this is going to be a difficult situation. That said, no one expected that much from CJ Stroud last year. The Texans were viewed as having a pretty weak group of pass catchers last season. And CJ Stroud had a monster year. So you really do never know. Bo Nix, set records for completion percentage this year, but a lot of his passes were at or behind the line of scrimmage. Like I said, I'm not a scout. I'm not a professional analyst. I can't tell you with certainty what kind of quarterback Bo Nix is going to be. Obviously, Sean Payton likes him a lot. But it was a reach in the sense of where he was taken versus what most teams had as a grade on him. But as I said before, when you're QB needy and the guy you want is on the board and you think it's your only chance to get him, you take him. And I'm sure everyone drafting right behind Denver was like, that's great. Because now a better player just got pushed back in one spot on top of when Atlanta took Penix. So, it just pushed better players. And you look at some of the players that went in the kind of late teens and early 20s, I think a lot of teams were like, oh, I didn't think, Quenyon Mitchell was going to be here at the 22nd pick, or I didn't think Jared Verse would be here, or I didn't think Fautanu would be there. So it kind of helped everyone. Everyone can thank the Broncos for taking Bo Nix. So I mentioned the Raiders another team. It was interesting. You had the Vikings at 11, the Broncos at 12, and the Raiders at 13, all needing a quarterback, just like you had the top 3 teams in the draft all needing a quarterback. the cycle repeated when we got out of the top 10. But by the time the Raiders went to pick, because they hadn't successfully moved up, there were no quarterbacks left other than like Spencer Rattler, who they weren't going to take at that stage of the draft. So they took Brock Bowers, which was surprising to many because, they took Michael Mayer with a second-round pick, a high second-round pick a year ago, and he came on in the second half of the season and looked like kind of a player. He's more of a traditional tight end, I would say, than Brock Bowers. But what did you think of this pick? What did you make of the Raiders taking Bowers at 13, which was good value, I think, for where people thought he would go, but doesn't really line up so much with need necessarily?
Yeah, well, from kind of adding to that, from what I've heard, Brock Bowers isn't, your traditional tight end. He's more of a weapon. And so I don't hate the pick. Outside of quarterback, I don't really know what needs the Raiders had or have, but they took a best player approach, and I'll never fault the team for doing that.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
It took 15 picks before the first defensive player was selected in. There were only 9 total defensive players selected in the first round. Is that a testament to the strength of the skilled players in this draft, or was that more of a result of team need and draft order, do you think, Dave?
I think it was sort of a reflection of where the best talent in this draft was, and it was at offensive line, wide receiver, and again, quarterback. They weren't necessarily better players than some of the defenders that went after them, but quarterbacks just get overdrafted. So, when you look at the first round, there were 32 selections, 6 quarterbacks, 9 offensive linemen, and 7 wide receivers, plus Brock Bowers. Quick math, that's like 23 or 24 of the I think it's 23 of the 32 picks. And I think it's I guess it's a reflection of 2 things. One, having so many quarterbacks that teams thought were worth a first round pick. 2, the direction the NFL is going in generally. Kind of the only defenders that tend to go in the first round for the most part are corners, edges, and sometimes defensive tackles, because those are sort of the premium positions. You don't really see like interior linebackers and safeties that much going in the first round. And so I think that it's a reflection of where the game is going a little bit, but also just where the talent was in this draft. I mentioned that 7 wide receivers went in the first round, and a run at receiver, or a mini run, kind of started at pick 23 when the Jaguars, who had to be thrilled that this worked, the board fell the way it did, got the 4th receiver in the round, Brian Thomas, after signing Gabe Davis to a big money deal. They also have Christian Kirk, who they added the year before. Are we seeing a trend, do you think, of teams, and we talked about the Bears earlier too, kind of prioritizing having 3 kind of big weapons at wide receiver?
I think we are, Dave, and what we're also seeing now is teams doing a better job of building more around their quarterbacks that are on rookie deals. So adding more talent while they can, while they're not paying their quarterback, 10, 30 or 40% of the salary cap.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, without naming, outside of Rashee Rice, Kansas City had possibly the worst wide receiver group in 2023, and they made it a priority to strengthen that unit with the addition of Hollywood Brown, and then traded up for Xavier Worthy in the draft. Where do you rank this group of wide receivers in the NFL?
Yeah, I think my answer is going to depend on how long Rashee Rice's suspension ends up being, because if he's unavailable for a lot of the season, I think it's still kind of an average group at best. I think if he's available for the majority of the season, between him and Hollywood, the fast rookie, and I always consider Travis Kelce when I think about their receiver group, and I know he's a year older, but he doesn't really play the role of a traditional tight end. He's kind of just a big and very hard to cover slot receiver. So I think if you include Kelce in the group, that takes them to at least average and maybe above average. But for me, it's going to depend a lot on how much Rashee Rice is able to suit up this year. But having said all of that, they clearly improved over last year, and that's kind of my big takeaway is even though they've won the last 2 Super Bowls, it's like they kind of did that despite the wide receiver room they've had since moving on from Tyreek Hill. They've really, not had a good group. They've had a lot of guys who just haven't really worked out, like Sky Moore and Kadarius Toney, MVS, Michael Hartman. Like they're kind of role players. None of them has really stepped forward. They had Juju there for a year, but none of them has really stepped forward to assume anything close to a wide receiver 1 role. Rashee Rice did kind of down the stretch last year. So they've improved the group, and I think that's kind of that's my bottom line. So the team they played in the Super Bowl, San Francisco, had sort of a receiver dilemma a little bit coming into this draft. There was rumors that Brandon Ayuk was requesting a trade. A lot of people think that they can't really pay both Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk going forward. And then they selected Ricky Pearsall at the very end of the first round. For you, was that pick an indicator that they're ready to move on from one of those guys, if not before this season, then after this season's completed?
Yeah, one would think so, Dave. But even if both Ayuk and Deebo start the season in San Francisco, we know that Deebo has an injury history, and if Ayuk doesn't get a new deal or get traded, he could potentially hold out. So Pearsall could get those additional reps and, maybe be closer to ready at the start of the season and be more valuable than one would think if any of those scenarios were to play out. We saw the Carolina Panthers again with another one of the more head-scratching draft picks there in the first round, and they can't seem to get out of their own way. They traded up for Xavier Legette, who probably would have been there at pick 33. Is David Tepper the worst owner in the NFL?
All right. Well, I'll take that as kind of 2 separate questions because I'm not sure how much he makes the calls on draft day. But I do think that with Dan Snyder out of the league, when you look at the recent history of the Panthers, the number of coaches they've gone through, the blockbuster trade they made that didn't work, the fact that they got rid of Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore, kind of like anyone good on that roster 3 years ago, or really good, and I'll throw Brian Burns in there too, is not on that roster anymore. And you got to fault the owner for some of that because he controls the checkbook. And then there was that video of him like going into the restaurant and knocking the guy's hat off his head. Like he's like Dan Snyder in that he's getting nothing but bad press. And right now he's probably the most disliked owner in the league just because of the stories that sort of have circulated and how that team has become so bad. And as for the Panthers, when you win 2 games and you don't have a first, you should be picking at the top of the draft. And instead they're picking at the top of round 2 because of the trade they made a year ago to get Bryce Young. So look, I think that they have improved the cast around Bryce Young to a degree. I mean, Xavier Legette was a player who kind of had one really good year in college, but unclear why that was, why it took him to the end of his college career to do that, and how much he'll help. They brought in Deontay Johnson. So hopefully things will be a little better. And they drafted James Brooks, the running back. So hopefully things will start to look up there and the owner can kind of fade into the background like he should, and let the football people, including their new head coach, Dave Canales, run the team.
Yeah.
So, Paul, let's just we'll do a couple of best and worst now that we've had a chance to kind of digest the draft. And I'll preface this by saying, a lot of times the so-called experts, give teams a D or a C- for a draft, and it ends up being a great draft. And the bottom line is none of us really know. We're just kind of looking at it from the standpoint of what needs did this team have? What kind of value did they get for the picks they made? Did they address their needs? So let's each pick a team from the AFC and the NFC. Paul, in your estimation, which AFC and NFC teams had the best draft?
AFC, I'll go with the Pittsburgh Steelers. They solidify that offensive line, and then they get arguably the best linebacker in the draft. I believe it was the 4th round, and Payton Wilson, who I know has some injury concerns, but to get him there at that value is insane value. And then NFC, I'll go with the Green Bay Packers. I really like what they did, addressing their offensive line and then bolstering that defense.
Yeah, I like both of those. In fact, the Steelers are also my pick in the AFC. And, the Steelers and Packers, I think if you look at the last 15 to 20 years, I think the Steelers, Packers, and Ravens, and maybe the Rams in more recent years, especially considering how few first-round picks they've had, have drafted the best. They've had the most guys become stars and get second contracts with their team. And they found like late round gems. I really like what the Steelers did. Like they knew they had to improve their offensive line, that was the biggest weakness on their team. And they just hammered it. They took 3 linemen, I think, in their first 4 or 5 picks, and got really good value on most of those picks, I thought. And I'll stay in Pennsylvania for the NFC. I'll go with the Philadelphia Eagles. And I know, they sort of trade more than any team, and they did it again this year. They were moving all over the place. But I'm kind of doing this a little bit on the strength of their first 2 picks. The rest of their draft I thought was fine. But getting Quenyon Mitchell in the first round and getting Cooper DeJean in the second round, in both cases falling to them, well past where, from a value standpoint, people thought they would go. And given how bad the Eagles secondary was last year, like the Lions did the same thing, actually. The Lions took corners with their first 2 picks and also got good value. So I think both of those teams, they're both contenders in the NFC for sure. They're Super Bowl hopefuls, and they both kind of hammered their weakest position early in the draft. And by taking 2 guys in the first 2 rounds, you kind of, increase the chances that one of them is going to hit big when they're both like kind of highly rated talents. So I liked what both of those teams did. I also really liked what the Packers did, but I didn't want to just give the same 2 answers as you gave. So those are my picks.
Well, Dave, leave it to me to have the worst. Give me your worst NFC and worst AFC drafted team, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like cheap to say the Falcons for the NFC, but I will say them because as much as I sort of understand maybe the long-term thinking in taking a quarterback with the 8th pick, and I don't know how hard they tried to trade down, but this team on paper probably is the best team in the NFC South, but they do have some needs, and they haven't had a pass rush in like 5 years. And they didn't really address it much in this draft with big name talent, and they could have. And again, I'm fine with taking Michael Penix if you believe in him, but not right after you gave Kirk Cousins $100 million. That just to me was head scratching enough that I'll go with the chalk and say the Falcons. But they could prove me wrong. Michael Penix could end up being a 10-year All-Pro for them, and a lot of people will be eating crow on that. The AFC, it was interesting because the AFC best draft was a little hard for me to figure out. And the AFC worst draft is even harder for me to figure out because I think most of the teams in the AFC, even the Raiders and the Broncos, who kind of had a little bit head scratching first picks, I thought they made some good picks later in the round, but I'll go with the Raiders because they really kind of needed to come out of this draft with a quarterback, and they weren't able to get one. And they had other needs like running back. They really didn't take anyone until pretty late in the draft. Brock Bowers, I do like taking best player available. I'm not going to fault them for that. So this isn't really about the Bowers pick. I just think for them it was kind of the Raiders are always a weird team the way they draft, and I think they just kind of ignored some big needs that they had. So I'll give them my worst grade. But I don't think any AFC team had a really bad draft, to be perfectly honest. Who are your worsts in each conference?
For me, I'll go NFC with the Carolina Panthers. I don't understand the move to get Leggett. And then AFC, Denver Broncos. I mean, just taking Bo Nix at 12 is a disaster waiting to happen in my eyes. I understand that they didn't have a second or third round pick, but I would imagine that somebody might have wanted to trade up to 12 to get a player. They could have acquired more draft capital, but just to draft for need and draft a player that so many analysts are out on is, I don't know, man. That's just bad business for me.
I got you. All right. Well, we're going to get to the part of the show that everyone's been looking for, which is some fantasy analysis as we move through here. So we'll start with the Chiefs, and we talked about the additions they've made at wide receiver. In your eyes, is that enough to bring Patrick Mahomes, like in season-long play, back into the conversation as the potential QB1, kind of with the quote-unquote running quarterbacks that have finished ahead of him in fantasy points the last couple of years?
Well, you brought up a good point. I guess it's TBD depending on how long Rashid Rice's suspension is going to be. But let's just say he plays 12 games. Yeah, I think Mahomes is in for a huge season, and he's my QB1 this year and for the foreseeable future.
All right, can't fault you for that. Mine is Josh Allen, just because if you look at the last 5 years or 4 years, I don't think he's finished lower than the QB2. I think he's got the highest floor, and I think he'll keep running like he's been running. It hurts Mahomes. Yeah, I've got him somewhere. I haven't done full rankings yet, but I will move Mahomes up from where I had him before last season a little bit.
JJ McCarthy, we talked about him earlier, has Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson in his arsenal and offers rushing upside. Could he finish the season as a top 12 fantasy QB?
He could, but I'm not going to bank on it. As I said earlier, I suspect that the opening day starter is going to be Sam Darnold. McCarthy's definitely going to play this year and play a lot. But if I'm thinking about the whole season, and in college, he was never really asked to throw that much. And so I think that's going to be an adjustment for him on a Vikings team that is probably the worst team in their division, but isn't a bad team. They did win the division 2 years ago. But I don't know that he's ready to kind of step in and do what Justin Herbert did as a rookie, or CJ Stroud, and just, win games by throwing the ball. And throw the ball, 30 to 45 times a game when it's needed. Even though the Vikings have the pass catchers to do that, we've never seen him have to do that in college. So I think that's going to be a bit of an adjustment. He's still pretty young. So I would not bet on him being, for all the reasons I just said, I would not bet on him being a top 12 fantasy QB in his rookie year. Another rookie QB that I do think has a shot at that is Jaden Daniels, just because of the rushing upside. And he also has some pretty good weapons in the receiving core on the Commanders. And if their defense is as bad as it was last year, they're going to need to chase points, which always is a helpful thing when you're thinking about fantasy. I mean, the Commanders had the worst. As bad as the Eagles were on the back end, I think the Commanders were dead last in the league in most pass defense categories, including touchdown passes allowed. So Daniels might need to be, kind of doing everything. He's very athletic. He's got good weapons, as I said, McLaurin, Dotson, Brian Robinson. Do you think he'll have the best fantasy season of these 6 rookie QBs?
Yeah, I would not be at all surprised if he had the best season of all rookie quarterbacks. I don't see him being better than Caleb this year. At the same time, though, if because of his rushing upside, I could see there being the possibility of that happening. Drake May and Bo Nix landed in the worst spots from a fantasy perspective and in Superflex leagues. You have to use a first-round pick to get them. Are they worth stashing in Dynasty, or are they better buy low candidates maybe towards the end of the year next summer?
Yeah, I don't think I'd use a first rounder on either one of them in a dynasty setup. I might on Drake May. I don't think I would on Bo Nix because, in both cases, it's probably, at the earliest 2025 that they're startable in a super flex, as your QB2. And that's at the earliest, in my view. Just given the supporting casts around them and, what those teams need to do to get better on offense. So given the choice, I would, maybe try to take one of the receivers. If I can't get one of the other quarterbacks in the first round in a rookie draft, I'd probably be looking at one of the wide receivers or Bowers over them. But you're more the dynasty guy than me, so I'm curious about, before I ask you the next question, your answer to this question.
May will definitely be a buy low at some point in the season for me. I don't know how good New England will be in 2024. Nix, I'm staying away from in dynasty and might draft a little bit in best ball only because, he could offer a spike week here and there. If Sean Payton is the coach that we think he is, Bo Nix should have a couple of usable weeks, I would think.
Yeah, that's fair. So let's, we've barely talked about running backs this entire episode because this was not a draft, with a lot of big names at running back. I don't think a running back went off the board maybe till late in the second round. Certainly none in the first, but the first three RBs drafted were Jonathan Brooks, who's coming off an ACL injury in November, but is supposedly ahead of schedule. Trey Benson, who went to the Cardinals, where he'll compete with James Conner, and Jalen Wright from Tennessee, who goes to Miami, where they have two other running backs ahead of him, presumably on the depth chart. Who do you like most for fantasy purposes? And maybe give me your season long and your dynasty answer.
I like Benson the most because I don't think he needs an injury to get on the field. Wright is definitely in the best situation without question. And Brooks is great for dynasty, but I find it hard to see him playing before October. If Carolina gets off to a rough start early, they have no reason to rush him back. So I like Benson the most this year. What about you, Dave?
Yeah, I think I like Benson the most this year. I've learned not to bet against James Conner because it seems like every year everyone's expecting him to get surpassed on the depth chart or to get hurt again. And he's just been really good. He's been one of the best kind of like 3-down all-purpose backs over the last couple of years. Even when Kyler Murray's been hurt, he's just been pretty steady. But he's getting older. I'm sure they'd like to lessen his workload. He does have an injury history. So I agree. I think of these three, certainly for this season, I would probably draft Benson first. Now, for this season, we won't be drafting and redrafts for several months. And if it looks like Jonathan Brooks is a go from day one, then I think that did I call him James Brooks earlier in the episode? I think I did. Who's a famous TV producer. That's one of those slips. So I apologize for that late in the episode. But Jonathan Brooks, I think that he has less competition. He's got Chuba Hubbard and maybe Miles Sanders if they don't trade him. So I kind of like his path. I just think it's hard to know what to expect from that offense. They may score the fewest touchdowns in the NFL other than Denver. So, I'm a little leery of that as well. So that's my answer is the same as yours. Long way of saying Trey Benson.
I got you. Braylon Allen and Blake Corum, two other running backs that were, Blake Corum more so was highly touted coming into the draft. And Braylon Allen, there was kind of some questions there, but I know people were excited about him. They don't land in the best fantasy situations. However, they are an injury away from being the lead back on potentially great offenses. Are they handcuffs or do they offer standalone value in 2024?
I'm thinking right now of both of them more as handcuffs. I mean, I think Breece Hall's sort of too good to take off the field much. And the Jets still have, kind of other other running backs in the fold that will compete for touches on passing downs and things like that. So I think of him more as a handcuff, or if he has standalone value, it's pretty low for this season. Blake Corum, Sean McVay's history is to ride one back and ride him to death, and we saw it last year with Kieran Williams when he was healthy. We used to see it with Todd Gurley. Maybe it's a little different this year with Blake Corum, but as of now, I'm thinking of him more as a handcuff than as a guy, who might get 10 to 12 touches a game, which would give him some standalone value. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about some of the wide receivers, which, like I said, there were 7 of them that went in the first round. So sort of a lot for fantasy players to sink their teeth into, both in terms of dynasty and rookie drafts, but also in season long. Some of these guys have a chance, I think, to be pretty fantasy relevant. Namely, and at the top of the list, Marvin Harrison Jr., who went with the 4th pick to the Cardinals, and Malik Neighbors, who went with the 6th pick to the Giants. Both of those guys go to a team that definitely did not have a clear number 1 receiver before taking those guys. And so they should both immediately step into, alpha dog wide receiver 1 roles and plenty of volume. Of the 2, who would you prefer in fantasy for this season?
I'll have to go Harrison, just because he has the better quarterback and there's less questions about the team and offense overall in Arizona. I just heard yesterday that there's going to be potentially a quarterback competition between Drew Lock and Daniel Jones. I don't want to hear that.
Yeah, and I would go Harrison also. I know Neighbors is the more explosive player, but I think Harrison is, Harrison did it for more years in college, and I think he's probably a tiny bit more ready to just sort of step in and be the number 1 receiver on a team right off the bat. And as you said, there's a difference in quarterback quality, which I think makes a difference as well. So I would go Harrison too, but I think Malik Neighbors, I haven't really looked at ADP or anything yet. It's too early for that. But if he's going in like the 4th or 5th round of fantasy drafts in August, I won't be surprised. Maybe even earlier. You might have to go a little earlier to get him. Harrison could be like a late 2nd rounder, I think, the way, or like around the 2-3 turn, as I sort of just think about what his value. And then that might be too rich for some people, but I do think that, people have the memory of Jamar Chase, who was taken late. There were all those reports of him dropping balls in practice, and as a rookie, he was a steal. We've seen what Amon-Ra did. We've seen what Puka Nacua did last year, and those guys were later round picks. But the idea that a rookie can't come in right away and, be a top 10 or 15 wide receiver in the NFL, I think has been dispelled. So I think both of those guys will probably be a little bit overdrafted. But it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. Another player who lands in a really good situation was Ladd McConkey, and he's paired with Justin Herbert, and he's considered the wide receiver 1 for the Chargers as of today. But LA is expected to be a run-heavy offense in 2024 with Jim Harbaugh there. Is McConkey a buy low or sell high player for you in 2024?
I know people look at the sort of run heavy thing and think it means that no receivers can have value there. The thing to remember about the Chargers is that Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, and Gerald Everett are all gone, and they were probably their top 4 pass catchers, total catches over the last 2 years in some order. Probably Keenan at the top, then Eckler, and I don't know, Mike Williams was hurt a decent amount, but they've really had a drain of pass catchers there. And they've got Trevor Lawrence, they've got Justin Herbert, and he can throw, and he's had a lot of games in his career where he's thrown 40 to 50 passes. And they're not going to be winning every game, and they're not going to be in every game isn't going to be a close game where they can just stick with the run. They are going to throw the ball. And my guess is they're going to throw the ball more than people expect. And my guess is Justin Herbert is going to kind of insist that they throw the ball more than people expect, and is going to change plays at the line of scrimmage when he believes he can hit something. And I think Ladd McConkey is potentially in for a really high volume season. Maybe he isn't, but could he have the year that Amon-Ra St. Brown had as a rookie a few years ago? He could. He's that kind of receiver. He'll operate a lot of underneath stuff. He's got good hands. So I'm pretty bullish on him. I think he's a buy low and try to get him on your roster for this season, because they don't have a ton in addition to him on that roster in terms of pass catchers. And I don't think they'll be as run heavy as everyone makes them out to be. What do you think about Ladd for this year?
Yeah, I like him. And, I know I was in charge of the show sheet today, but it just kind of dawned on me. I don't think anybody's going to sell him low right now. So to call him a buy low seems kind of silly thinking about it now. That being said, yeah, I really like him. He's Matt Hartman, reception perception. He's like the wide receiver guru of the fantasy community. He said that Ladd McConkey is the best separator in this draft, and you pair him with Justin Herbert and with Jordan Palmer. I like the situation, and he's somebody I'll be drafting everywhere I can.
All right. We mentioned Drake May earlier. So, the Patriots, as I said, 7 of their 8 draft picks were offense, and they grabbed 2 receivers on day 2 in Jalen Polk from Washington and Javon Baker. They still have Kendrick Bourne. They still have Pop Douglas on the roster. Is Juju still there? Maybe he is. How are you approaching? Yeah, how are you approaching this large group of pass catchers, of unproven pass catchers, I should say, in fantasy?
I think it's, in a situation like this, it's good to mix them all in. I just feel like that makes the most sense, because we don't really know who's going to be the number 1 receiver, number 2. So instead of trying to figure that out and focus on drafting one player, kind of making an empty bet, if you will, I think it's good to draft all of them where it makes sense, and again, sprinkle them all in and diversify the portfolio, if you will.
Good investment advice. I like it, and I agree. I think you look at this receiving core. This receiving core is as hard to handicap as any in the NFL, especially because you don't really know what the quarterback play is going to be, how soon Drake May is going to start, how pass heavy they're going to be, in their first year post Bill Belichick. It'll be interesting to see what the Patriots look like. I mean, that team has looked like one thing for 25 years. So it's a new era is interesting to see there.
Yeah, it is. Trevor Lawrence has Christian Kirk, Gabe Davis, Brian Thomas Jr., and Evan Ingram to throw the ball to. Who was your favorite fantasy target of this group?
Yeah, I think it's still Christian Kirk. When I look at the last 2 years, last year he got hurt at the end of the season, but he's pretty much led them or close to the lead in targets over all the games he's played as a Jaguar over the last 2 years. Trevor Lawrence trusts him, knows him, and all those other guys are new. Well, Ingram isn't, but Ingram's getting a little old now too. I mean, he's almost 10 years in the league. He'll get his looks. I mean, he's a mismatch still coming out of the tight end position, but of the 4, I like Kirk the most because Ingram is a tight end. He has kind of that positional value. So there could be instances where I would draft him ahead of Kirk, just because if there's like a run on tight ends or something. But I like Kirk the most of the pass catchers there. Will he have the most fantasy points? That's a good question. Gabe Davis, I think no matter where he plays, is a best ball guy. Like, he's just too hard to plug into your lineup every week because he's so boomer bust. And if he was boomer bust with Josh Allen, on a team with other receiving weapons that were better than him, like Stephon Diggs and, some of the tight ends they had there, or who got a lot of targets, that's probably going to be the case again in Jacksonville with maybe not as many booms. So he's a guy I'm scared of. And Thomas is a rookie, so I don't know. He's got a lot of upside, but with proven mouths to feed there, it may take a little while before Brian Thomas is getting a lot of volume.
That's fair.
Paul, we talked about the Raiders before and their pick of Brock Bowers. They actually have, while they have a little bit of a, they have Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell in their quarterback room, which is certainly towards the lower end of the NFL, and they didn't solve their long-term quarterback question this offseason. They still have Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers, Michael Mayer. They added a great weapon in Brock Bowers. They lost Josh Jacobs. I'm not really sure. Zamir White would appear to be the starting running back. But if you're drafting their QBs, looking at those weapons they have, are like in a super flex, let's say, and you're trying to draft a second quarterback, are you looking to draft both of them so to make sure you have somebody, or are you just avoiding it entirely?
No, with this, depending on the format, drafting both does make sense. It's not often you would handcuff a quarterback, right? But I think it just kind of depends on your team build, especially in a best ball league. But I think, I don't know, the Raiders seem to, when they talk, they speak highly of Aiden O'Connell, but then when you look at Gardner Minshew's contract, it's like they paid him to almost be the guy to be the bridge quarterback. So it is a bit of a difficult situation to figure out, but I would probably put my money, if I'm making the decision now, I think I'd put my money on Gardner Minshew. What about you?
Yeah, I think so too. I think I didn't think I know they brought him in there to compete, but I think that in all likelihood he ends up being the starter there. But I think it's a situation where it's safe to say both QBs will play.
Right. All right, Dave. So from a fantasy perspective, which team had the best draft? Let's pick one from the AFC and the NFC.
Yeah, I mean, just purely from a fantasy perspective, I don't see how the NFC answer could be anyone other than the Bears, who took,
right,
a quarterback and a receiver in the top 10. I mean, they were the only team with 2 top 10 picks, and they used them both on players that people will be drafting early and often in rookie drafts and will be drafting in all formats in season-long fantasy. So I think the Bears are a pretty easy answer. The AFC is much harder because there really wasn't a team in the AFC that added a lot of weaponry, if you will. Of the 14 in the first round, there were only 5 AFC teams that took a quarterback or a receiver or a tight end. So, and none took a running back. So, you didn't have a lot of AFC teams kind of bolstering the skill positions early in the draft. So I'm going to go with a weird answer, a team that only took 1 skill position player in the entire draft, and that's the Pittsburgh Steelers. They took Roman Wilson, the wide receiver from round 3, and I think he's a good player who will, help replace the kind of slot volume that Deontay Johnson got. But by adding 3 offensive linemen, I feel like they helped the fantasy prospects of Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren, Justin Fields, and Russell Wilson. That should elevate the entire offense. So it's kind of a weird answer because all they did was add a day 2 receiver who I think will be good, but nothing special as a rookie, and probably a guy that if you're drafting him in a season-long draft, you're taking him very late. In a rookie draft, you might take him in the second round or something like that. But those are my answers. Who are your answers, Paul?
Of course, NFC, it has to be the Chicago Bears. And a bit of a, what might shock you, Dave, is I like what the Patriots did only because they addressed the quarterback, the most important position, and then they sprinkled in some later day 2 guys whose skill sets complement each other well. And Javon Baker, who's more of an outside receiver, and then Jalen Polk, who's a separator, probably your typical slot guy. So I like what they did there.
Yeah, I guess long term, that's a better answer than mine. I was kind of thinking of it like the prospects of the whole offense from fantasy. And last year, in part because their quarterback play was so bad, the Steelers were, you could start their running backs, but they had two of them, so that made it tricky. And it was kind of hard to start even like George Pickens and Deontay Johnson and Pat Freiermuth when he was healthy. They didn't throw any touchdowns all year. So they were a tough offense to trust. And I think this year, from a fantasy perspective, I mean, it's never going to be like it was with Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown and Ben Roethlisberger. But I think they will return to being a decent offense from a fantasy perspective, regardless of which quarterback ends up winning the job there. So, Paul, let's just do everyone's favorite thing, some sleepers and busts. Is there a sleeper or two from this rookie class that you like in fantasy for just this season and for Dynasty, and then maybe a bust as well?
Okay, so you threw a curveball at me, Dave. I thought we were just talking about overall. So my sleeper, Dynasty sleeper, I'll say Spencer Rattler, backup quarterback now of the New Orleans Saints. And then I'll do Tyrone Tracy, maybe not so much a sleeper because people have started talking about him a couple of weeks ago, even before the draft, but running back for the New York Giants. And then my bust, I mean, I hate to keep harping on this guy, but I got to go with Bo Nix, man.
Yeah, that's fair. A couple sleepers. I like Malachi Corley on the Jets. I know that Aaron Rodgers traditionally has not thrown much to rookies, but after Garrett Wilson, their receiving core is like these old guys who the Packers got rid of. I don't think Allen Lazard can really play anymore. So I like Corley if Aaron Rodgers is healthy to carve out a role there and have some fantasy value this year. Some deeper sleepers, although this first guy I think is no longer a deep sleeper because everyone's talking about him. But running back Kamani Vidal on the Chargers, who I think they took in the 5th round. Austin Eckler is gone. They didn't really have anyone else who kind of stepped up as a lead back. We know Jim Harbaugh, despite what I said earlier, he does want to run the ball. And so I think Vidal could have some value. Also, Dylan Laub, I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, on the Raiders. Similarly,
Laub, I believe.
Laub, yeah, they're coming into the season with Zamir White as their presumptive starter. So I think that's a job or some work is up for grabs there. And I think he could step into that. And bust for me, for this season, I'll go JJ McCarthy because, again, I don't think he's going to start right away. And I think people who take him thinking he's going to, or that he's going to come in right away and put up the kind of numbers Kirk Cousins put up in that offense with that receiving group are going to be disappointed. I don't think McCarthy's a bust as an NFL player. I think he's going to be a good fantasy asset to have down the road. But I think for this year, I'm not that enthused about him. And for a guy who went in the 1st round, also Ricky Pearsall, because if everyone stays healthy in that offense, kind of the best he can do is what Juwan Jennings did last year. There's just too many. Between George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, there's just so many guys who demand a lot of targets on that offense. Here's another one. I really like Pearsall longer term, and I would gobble him up in Dynasty because I think as soon as one of those other receivers moves on, he steps right in, and I like him as a player. But I think for this season, he's probably going to be overvalued.
I like those picks. I like the boldness, man.
Wait till you get to my bold call.
Yes. Speaking of bold calls, here we are with bold call. We're going to do rookie edition. Dave, give us your bold call.
All right. Maybe this isn't that bold, but I don't think Michael Penix is going to start a game in the first 2 years of his career, unless the Falcons play a meaningless game at some point. Obviously, if Kirk Cousins gets hurt, I'm wrong. But if Cousins is healthy, and assuming the Falcons don't have any late season meaningless games, I don't think Michael Penix gets a start in the first two years where Cousins' money is guaranteed, because I think Cousins will play well and there won't be a reason to to start Penix. What is your bold call, Paul?
My bold call is there will be a rookie player finishing in the top 12 at every position in fantasy. Of course, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end.
I like it. I like it. On a future show, I'm going to hold you to that, and you're going to have to tell me which guy so I know to draft him. So I know to get him in all my drafts.
Yes, sir. I'll do my best, my friend. Dave, I enjoyed the discussion tonight. It's been a long time, man. The rust was definitely there, but I'm glad we got to get back on the mic.
Yeah, really, really fun. I'm glad, the draft came and went. I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it. Paul, remind everyone where they can find you on X and get at your content.
Yes, you can find me on X at Paul_Ryan15, and my content is there also on X and on YouTube. Dave, what about you?
Yep, I'm at PigskinPapers on X, and you can, I link my content there, and you can also get it at thepigskinpapers.com. And thanks all for tuning in, and it's been a lot of fun doing a day show, a matinee.
Yes, sir. Guys, we appreciate y'all, and we will see y'all next week.